Today's reading is taken from Luke chapter 4, and it's verses 14 to 30. And if you're looking at a church Bible, it can be found on page 1031. Jesus returned to Galilee in the power of the Spirit, and news about him travelled through the whole countryside. He was teaching in their synagogues, and everyone praised him. He went up to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and on the Sabbath day he went into the synagogue, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. Unrolling it, he found the place where it is written, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour." Then he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened on him. He began by saying to them, "Today the scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." All spoke well of him and were amazed at his gracious words that came from his lips. "Isn't this Joseph's son?" they asked. Jesus said to them, "Surely you will quote this proverb to me, 'Physician, heal yourself.' And you will tell me, 'Do here in your hometown what we have heard that you did in Capernaum.' Truly, I tell you," he continued, "no prophet is accepted in his hometown. I assure you that there were many widows in Israel in Elijah's time, when the sky was shut for 3.5 years, and there was a severe famine throughout the land. Yet Elijah was not sent to any of them, but to a widow in Zarephath, in the region of Sidon. And there were many in Israel with leprosy in the time of Elisha, the prophet, yet not one of them was cleansed, only Naaman the Syrian." All the people in the synagogue were furious when they heard this. They got up, drove him out of town, and took him to the brow of the hill on which the town was built, in order to throw him off the cliff. But he walked right through the crowd and went on his way. This is the word of the Lord.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Can everyone hear me? I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed by technology at the moment. Even though I work with computers in my day-to-day life, I've never had the headset before, and I've got this amazing contraption that Lauren has kindly set up, called a clicker, I believe, so it means that Sarah can relax and not have to keep looking at me for when she's got to press the space bar and so on. Right. Oh, I'm holding it the wrong way, I think. That's it. Hooray. Right, so does anyone recognise this chap?
He was a young boy.
Anyone recognise? Yeah, I think Harry Potter. Anyone recognise who that is? Yes, so a few people here who've been to Sunday school, obviously. It's a more difficult one now. Anyone recognise him? Oh, Mike Ashley, that's right. Mike Ashley, for those who don't know, he's the chairman of Sports Direct, and he's also the owner of Newcastle United Football Club. You can see him at St James's Park there. And then we have... Anyone recognise this famous businessman and media personality? I believe he's taken up a new job as well, moved house. I'm talking about the man in the foreground. I don't know who the man in the background is. The guy with the moustache. So, can anyone see what they've all got in common? Apart from the fact that they're all male, obviously. You wanted out that one. Anyone see what they've all got in common? All right, so here's a clue. But can anyone remember where does Harry Potter live? What's the name of his road? Was it Privet?
Privet Drive.
Privet Drive. So was he happy there?
No.
Oh, okay. Does that give anyone an idea? So think of their hometowns. Think of their relationship with their home areas. Okay, so Harry Potter, he was obviously a celebrity in the wizarding world and at Hogwarts and places. When he went back to Privet Drive, he wasn't a celebrity at all, was he? He was very much a downtrodden person. He was hated by the Dursleys. Was it the Dursleys? His family. He lived in the cupboard under the stairs. Now, Mike Ashley has owned Newcastle United for about 12, 13 years. And I think it's fair to say he's not the most popular owner of a football club. In fact, I think he's been trying, for the last 10 years, he's been trying to sell the club and get rid of it. And he's on record as saying that he doesn't feel safe going there anymore. and you often see pictures of people or fans holding red cards, and I think they're obviously not happy with him. So I know he doesn't actually live there. He's a Cockney down in London, but you could say that is his footballing home, and he's not very welcome there when he goes there. Thinking about Donald Trump, where's Donald Trump from? New York. New York. Donald Trump, born and brought up in New York. His father, Fred, was also a businessman in New York, and as we all know, he lived in the Trump Tower in the heart of New York. And yet, during the presidential election, he knew there was no way he could win New York. He was just way behind. And in fact, he lost New York to Hillary Clinton by 59% to 37%. And he's one of there's hardly any of them. There's only 4 presidents in the whole of their history who've managed to win and become president without winning their home state. And so again, he's not very welcome, not very happy in his hometown. And finally, this all looks like a very forced sort of thing, doesn't it? And finally, we come to Jesus, and this is the subject of our talk today. It was Jesus, as we'll find out, Jesus was from Nazareth, and he didn't actually get on very well with the people there, to say the least. Right, so last week, as you know, Tim was talking on the encounter, face-to-face, of the prophets, of Simeon and Anna in the temple with the baby Jesus. Now, can anyone remember what happens next in the story after that, more or less? Can you think of anything that happens after that? Well, it could be, but actually after that you do get the stuff with Herod, with King Herod. So King Herod, for instance, obviously he realises that there's this baby somewhere who people are saying that he's the new king of the Jews. So he acts to wipe them out. And so this is what happens. So Joseph, Mary and Jesus, they have to escape. And you can just about see on that map, they travel from Bethlehem over to Egypt. And they stay in Egypt for a few years as refugees until Herod dies. And then when Herod dies, they come back, but then they still think it's not particularly safe to go back to Bethlehem or Jerusalem or that area. So in fact, they go back to where Joseph's originally from, which is Nazareth. And so you can see that way in the north of the country. And this is where the Bible starts to become a bit vague about Jesus' childhood. It just says, the child grew and became strong, he was filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was upon him. And the next, as Karen was saying, the next encounter we have with Jesus, basically when he's about 12, and there's a sort of artist's impression of Jesus in the temple, Jesus and his family had come down for one of the festivals to Jerusalem, and as people already know the story, he gets left behind because he's so keen to question and discuss things with the teachers of the law and the priests. And again, the Bible then fast forwards about 18 years or so, I think, and it says, and Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favour with God and man. And then the next thing that happens is that we have the coming of John the Baptist. Jesus himself gets baptized. Jesus is tempted in the wilderness, so he spends the 40 days in the wilderness, as we know. And finally, we reach today's passage, where it says, so Jesus returned to Galilee in the power of the Spirit, and news about him spread through the whole countryside. He was teaching in their synagogues, and everyone praised him. He went to Nazareth, where he'd been brought up. Now, if you read that quickly, it sounds as though Jesus came out of the wilderness, he had his 40 days there, and then he more or less just went straight to Nazareth and today's passage. But in fact, if you look carefully, it does say that he returns to Galilee in the power of the Spirit, and news about him spreads, and it's another verse where he goes to Nazareth. And if we look at the other accounts in Matthew, and if we compare Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it's actually clear that Jesus didn't go straight to Nazareth. And people actually think it might have been a year or so from the start of Jesus' ministry to him actually going to Nazareth. So you might be thinking, if he didn't go to Nazareth, where did he go? And here, this is a map. Can anyone see anything in that map? I don't know if people can see anything in that map. But somewhere in the middle, can you see Nazareth? Okay, can you just see Nazareth? So it's sort of like in the middle of the green bit to the west of the Sea of Galilee, somewhere there. And then there's a place called Capernaum. Can you see that on the northern coast, the northernward coast of the Sea of Galilee? Oh. The northernward coast of the Sea of Galilee is a town called Capernaum. And Jesus actually, instead of settling down in Nazareth, he actually went off to Capernaum. Does anyone know how far it is from Nazareth to Capernaum? Any guesses? Sorry? John says 25. Any more? 80. Anybody else? 30. It's actually about 40 miles from there. So Jesus took himself about 40 miles away. So it's not like us going off to Ealing or to Shepherd's Bush. It's more like if you decided to go all the way to towards Oxford or somewhere like that. So it's a fair distance, and if you think of the lack of transport and so on as well. And people say it would be probably about 2 to 3 days' walk if you went over there, and over quite rugged terrain as well. You might be wondering, why did Jesus decide to go to Capernaum? Because you'd think, so Jesus comes out of the wilderness, he now knows that he's got a calling on his life. He's come to establish the kingdom of God. He's basically come to turn the world upside down, and he's going to have to gather a group of people around him who are going to be like his disciples, and he's going to train them, and then he's going to leave them to continue the mission. There's lots of things he wants to do, and you'd have thought the most natural thing would be to settle down in his hometown in Nazareth and basically gather his friends, gather his family, and people like that, and build a movement in Nazareth and then spread everywhere. But he doesn't. He goes off to Capernaum, and you get the impression that the people he meets in Capernaum are sort of strangers to him. They don't really know who he is at all, and that's where he works. And he doesn't come back to Nazareth for a long time. And you might think, well, why would he do that? I think to see why he did, we have to sort of think about their society at the time. Like it was a very hierarchical society. It was a hierarchical society in the family. You can imagine the sort of extended family. There were probably all sorts of uncles, aunts, great-uncles, grandparents. People would know their place. And I sort of identify with this a bit as coming from an Indian, sort of Eastern background. I know in my family back in Calcutta, every single relative has a title and a name. So, for instance, here we talk about uncles and aunts, and in India, it's like you've got a particular title for your father's brothers who are older than your father. Then you've got another name for the father's brothers who are younger than your brother, rather younger than your father. Then you've got a name for the mother's brothers who are older than the mother, and a different name for the mother's brothers who are younger than than the mother. And it goes on, and obviously, and they're, the uncles' wives aren't just called aunts, they all have different names. And then you've got people that we would call uncles and aunts who are sort of like in-laws and so on. There's special names for all of them. And it carries on, and there's names for your grandparents, brothers and sisters, and so on. And it's a real hierarchy as well. Everyone knows their place, and everyone knows who's in charge, who's the head of the family. And obviously now, even in Calcutta and places like that, the system's broken down quite a bit because, times have changed and it's a much more modern society. And it's probably a bit like that here in Victorian times in terms of family and so on. So you had a hierarchical family structure. You also had a hierarchical society as well. And so within the society generally, people would know their place. So if you were a carpenter's son, it's almost guaranteed that you would become a carpenter. If you were a fisherman's son, you would take over the fisherman's business. If you're a farmer, you take over the farm. For instance, a carpenter's son wouldn't go off and become a teacher of the law. It just wouldn't happen. And so it's almost like if Jesus in Nazareth, what I think is that there's a whole weight of society and his family all tending to push him in a particular direction. And set against this is the fact that Jesus knew the calling on his life was to start a real revolution with himself at the center, with completely new teaching, and he was going to start a movement. And if he'd done that in Nazareth, there would have been problems. He would have ended up having issues with them. And I think that's why he decided to put some distance between himself and the people who knew him. And he set off for Capernaum and started up in Capernaum. And I think there's a lesson to us nowadays as well, because I think we can often have a situation where people feel that people are being, it's almost not exactly oppressed, but it's like you can have people in your lives who are dominant towards you, maybe to an excessive or unhealthy degree of control of your lives. This is quite common, and it could be, for instance, adult children with their parents, but not necessarily. It could be work colleagues, it could be friends, and so on. And I suppose the test of it is, how easy is it to say no to somebody? Do we have people that we find it really difficult to disagree with or say no to? And sometimes I think when that happens, we do have to do what Jesus did here and put some distance between us, try and get things on a more healthy basis. And obviously we don't really have time to go into that in too much detail, but if people are interested, there's a whole series of books by some Christian psychologists, Henry Cloud and John Townsend, which look at the whole question of boundaries and so on, which I'd recommend. And particularly a book called Hiding from Love by John Townsend, which Tony and Katie recommended to me years ago, which I found very helpful. Right, so coming back to Jesus, what was Jesus doing then? If he wasn't staying in Nazareth, he went to Capernaum. He called Peter, Andrew, James, and John in that sort of area. He was active in that area. He drove out evil spirits. He healed many people, lots of examples of healings. For instance, he healed a paralytic. He called the rest of the apostles. So, for instance, Matthew, for example, was probably working in the customs house at Capernaum. Let's say Nazareth was quite a small place, about 300 people in those days. It's just a village. Whereas Capernaum was a much bigger town. It was on the sort of trade route, and they would have had a customs house, which is where Matthew probably worked. He taught with authority, so much of his teaching was done during this time and in that area. So like the Sermon on the Mount, the various parables he gave would all have been in that Sea of Galilee sort of area near Capernaum. Other things he did, he calmed the storm. You probably remember when Jesus fell asleep in the boat and the disciples were panicking. Again, they think that happened during that first year. He healed a demon-possessed man, and he raised Jairus' daughter to life. So what's going on? So all this is going on. What's going on in Nazareth? So obviously the stories are spreading to Nazareth of what's going on. There's rumor and so on. So I wonder what were they saying? So looking in Mark chapter 3, we see this interesting passage where Jesus enters a house and his disciples are not even able to eat. It says when his family heard about this, they They went to take charge of him, for they said, he is out of his mind. And then we see, the next verse or a few verses later, Jesus' mother and brothers arrive. So they've obviously heard what's going on, and they've come all the way from Nazareth to Capernaum to find out what's going on, and they want to speak to him. And I think this explains why, in the next verse, it actually sounds quite rude. Jesus is actually quite rude. He says, who are my mother and my brothers? The person who does God's will is my mother and my brothers. And we often read that and we think, that was a bit rude of Jesus to act like that. They've only come to see him. But they hadn't just come to see him. They'd come to almost close him down. They'd come to bring him back home because they were worried about his mental health, basically. And you see this again and again in the Gospels, where Jesus feels he's being manipulated or being pushed in a particular direction. He is really almost fierce to the point of rudeness. He's assertive to the point of rudeness in asserting, because he knew very clearly what he had to do and what God wanted him to do, and he wasn't going to let people's expectations sort of push him in the wrong direction. And they were also asking, where did this man get his wisdom? And there's a bit of a loaded question here. Where did he? Because Jesus was going around teaching from Scripture. And this was really quite unusual. He was a carpenter's son. He wasn't a trained person. He wasn't training to be a teacher of the law. Because to be a teacher of the law, if you think of somebody like the Apostle Paul, he describes what training he went through, even though he was born in Tarsus in modern-day Turkey. And he was probably from a fairly wealthy background. They were obviously Roman citizens. And he was actually sent as a child to Jerusalem. And he was assigned to one of the rabbinical schools, the School of Gamaliel. And so that was the proper training for a teacher of the law. And Jesus and his family, that was beyond them. There was no way they could have sent him to Jerusalem for training. They were poor. And so there's a sort of snobbishness there. Where does he get his wisdom from? Who is this chap? Who does he think he is? He's just a carpenter's son. Why is he coming along trying to teach from Scripture? And they also said, and what about his miraculous powers? Where's he getting his miraculous powers from? And again, he's just the carpenter's son. We know him. He's one of us. He grew up with us. He's an ordinary person like us. It's almost like, who does he think he is? And in fact, I think because of that, they were just convinced that his powers weren't from God. So therefore, where were his powers from? And you can see in this passage where the Pharisees are quite open about it. It is only by Beelzebub, the prince of demons, that this fellow drives out demons. And interesting, it says Jesus knew their thoughts. So again, the people are thinking, where does he get his power from? It's probably from the devil. And so anyway, he turns up. Eventually, he comes to Nazareth. So we're coming to today's passage. He comes to Nazareth where he has been brought up. But then, unfortunately, he couldn't do many miracles there because of their lack of faith. So even all the miracles that he was doing elsewhere they'd heard about weren't happening in Nazareth. So just sum up, what were they saying? So the people of Nazareth, basically, they thought he was out of his mind. They're saying, who does he think he is? He's just the carpenter's son. They're asking, where did he get his wisdom? Where did he get his miraculous powers? And why can't he do any miracles here? So we get to this. So we get to the Sabbath day, and Jesus arrives at the synagogue. So you can feel that there's an atmosphere of hostility and skepticism already there. And it says he went there, as was his custom. And so in the service there, they would have started with some prayers, and then somebody would have got up and done the reading from the law of Moses. And the next thing was that there would be a reading from the prophet. At this point, Jesus stood up, and that would have signaled to everyone that he wanted to do that reading. And so they went along with it. They gave him the scroll of the prophet Isaiah. And you can see the scroll possibly looked something like that. And there's, I think, that's from Jesus of Nazareth, the film, possibly what it looked like as Jesus started to read from the scroll. And it says, unrolling it, he found the place where it is written, and then he read this passage from Isaiah. The Spirit of the Lord is on me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour. And basically everyone there would then have thought to themselves, immediately they would have thought, messianic passage. This is one of the passages that have marked out that this is a passage about the Messiah. So as far as they were concerned, this had nothing to say to them today. This was a passage for the future. It's about the Messiah when he comes. And then he rolled up the scroll, he gave it back to the attendant, and he sat down. And when he sat down, because the person who was going to do the teaching would always do it sitting down, when he sat down, that indicated he now wanted to speak. And so the eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened on him. So you can almost feel the tension in the air. They're wondering, what's he going to say? And he says, this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing. So he basically makes that claim. He's basically saying, I am the Messiah. This passage that you think is for the future about the Messiah, it's fulfilled today in your hearing. I am the Messiah. And I think this is where possibly Luke hasn't given us the whole picture. I don't think he's given us word for word the entire sermon of everything that Jesus preached that day. I think he says this is how Jesus started. And then it's almost like he hasn't bothered to tell us what Jesus said next. That's what I personally think. And so we don't really know what Jesus said next. He may have said something about the Isaiah passage. He may have done something more like the Sermon on the Mount, maybe preaching something like that. But whatever he said, people at first, they spoke well of him. They were amazed at his gracious words that came from his lips. But then it starts to change. They start thinking again, hang on a minute. He's Joseph's son. Who does he think he is? What's he doing? Why has he come? Why has he come to speaking us and telling us all this stuff? And then Jesus decides to basically, Jesus obviously knows all the criticism that's been going on. And he knows that they're sort of saying, oh, all the murmurings and stuff. You know, why can't he do any miracles? What about those miracles we saw that we keep hearing about in Capernaum? Why doesn't he do those? And so Jesus decides to confront them head on. And so he says to them, surely you will quote this proverb to me, physician, heal yourself, and you will tell me, do here in your hometown what you have heard that you did in Capernaum. And then he goes on to allude to two different stories, one involving the prophet Elijah and one about the prophet Elisha. And to understand this, we have to remember something about the history of Israel. That you'll probably remember that King David was the king of a united kingdom called Israel. And then he handed over to his son, King Solomon. But after Solomon's death, the kingdom split. It split into the northern part, Israel, and the southern part, Judah. And on the whole, the northern kingdom didn't really do very well. It seems like every single king was a bad king. They all defied God. They never did what they were supposed to do. They oppressed the poor. If you think of someone like King Ahab, confiscated someone's vineyard. They put up altars to false gods, all sorts of things. The kings of Judah was slightly different. Some of them were good, some of them were bad. The ones who were good seemed to be very good. But anyway, God sent prophets to the northern kingdom, Israel. And Elijah and Elisha were both prophets to the northern kingdom. But eventually, God's judgment came on that kingdom, and they were taken away by the Assyrians. And basically, they just disappeared. They never came back. That was God's judgment on them. Whereas the southern kingdom also faced God's judgment. The Babylonians took them away. But they did come back. They came back, and they managed to re-establish Jerusalem. They rebuilt the temple, and so on. So what Jesus is saying here is that you lot here in Nazareth, you're like that northern kingdom that Elijah and Elisha were speaking to. You're like that corrupt lot. And in fact, the capital of the northern kingdom was Samaria, which is, of course, where the Samaritans are based. So some people did come back from the northern exile, and they intermarried and so on. And so the Samaritans were sort of despised as well. So this is almost like the last straw for the people there. He's basically claiming that Jesus has come here. They're already thinking, who does he think he is? He comes here. He says he's the Messiah. On the other hand, he's not doing any miracles. And then he's comparing the people there with the corrupt northern kingdom that everyone knows is a really bad lot. And he's also saying that the only reason nothing's happening here is because God was blessing the Gentiles and so on like that. And so we get their reaction. And by now, they are absolutely furious. They've had enough. They get up and they drive him out of the town. They took him to the brow of the hill on which the town was built in order to throw him off the cliff. but he walked right through the crowd and went on his way. And so I think that it's basically that God intervened and miraculously preserved Jesus that day. So it's almost like you think of it like the parting of the Red Sea. The people just parted and Jesus walked through and went on his way, because the time wasn't right for Jesus to be killed just at that moment. So what can we learn from this? I think it's interesting just to look at what the reaction of those people in Nazareth was. Jesus was obviously hoping, and what would have been an ideal reaction? Jesus would have come, he would have explained everything, people would have responded and become his followers. A good number of people would have become his followers, and it would be recorded that, that it was a really great day in Nazareth. And in fact, it was the complete opposite. And I think at the root of it, so what was at the root of this behavior? So I think it was probably pride. They didn't like the fact that he was referring to them as though they were like the northern kingdom. There's unbelief and lack of faith, as we know he referred to that. But one of the other problems is that there's familiarity. They knew Jesus so well, and they just couldn't get it out of their heads that he was just somebody they knew well. And what was he doing? Carpenter's son, and all that stuff. And I wonder if that might be a problem for us as well. Some of us have been Christians for a while. We become familiar with the stories, and it's almost like we start going through the motions, really. And there's an interesting quote from Rick Warren, that familiarity breeds complacency. It's normally familiarity breeds contempt, isn't it? But I think this is quite interesting. Familiarity breeds complacency. And I wonder whether that sometimes is true of us, that we get into almost like complacency. We just go through the motions and so on. So what I did when I was looking at this, actually, as one does nowadays, I put this into Google. I put how to fight complacency in the Christian life. And I thought, let's see what comes up. And I ended up looking at, if I can see the name, a South African pastor called Andrew Robert. And he believes that the way to fight complacency is through expectation. It's having an expectation of God doing something. So for instance, expecting that God will answer our prayers, expecting that when we read the Bible, God will actually speak to us, expecting that things will happen when we come to church. And he sort of says, he gets quite worked up about it. He says, I challenge you to live your life full of expectation. Don't give in to discouragement and despair. Believe, 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 and be full of anticipation and expectation. And this is from Isaiah, sorry, I can't actually read that, it's Isaiah 40. Isaiah 40, and it's from the Amplified Bible, which is probably the longest Bible in the world, because they supplement the words with alternative meanings and so on. It says here, but those who wait for the Lord, who expect, look for and hope in him, shall change and renew their strength and power. They shall lift their wings and mount up close to God as eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint or become tired. And one of the things this chap, Andrew Robert, says, he's talking about early days of his ministry in South Africa, and he's saying, every day was an adventure. At night I would collapse into bed. I could not get to sleep fast enough to be able to get up and see what the next day would hold in store for me. And I was just thinking, imagine if we actually lived our lives like that, with such expectancy that we wake up in the morning and we think, I wonder what God's going to do today. It's just it's amazing, really, if we could do that. And the other thing I think can help us to ward off complacency is this idea of a heavenly hope. And we find this in this passage in Hebrews, which says, because if you think Jesus had a negative experience in Nazareth, but it wasn't his only negative experience. He had many of them where people didn't respond to him, and the way that he managed to cope with it was because of his heavenly hope. And it says here, for the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that he will not grow weary and lose heart. And I think it's just that image of being in heaven and the joy that gave him, that he was going to, eventually he would get through his mission. And despite all the suffering and pain and all the trouble with all the people and so on and opposition, eventually he was going to be sitting down at the right hand of the throne of God. And I think that's what kept him going. And really, that is something that's kept Christians going over the centuries in every generation. Just that hope of heaven, of knowing that our struggles are temporary, having that ultra long-term view that whatever's going on now, this is a short-term thing, and that one day we are going to be in heaven. That's something that's really inspired Christians throughout the ages. Now, last autumn, the hub I went to was the one on the Narnia series by C.S. Lewis. And right at the end of that, we were looking at the final book in the series, The Last Battle. And there's an amazing passage at the end where C.S. Lewis, he just completely lets rip with his imagination about what heaven is like and so on. And I remember that Carolyn, who led that session, how she sort of testified to the fact that just that story has been such an inspiration to Carolyn over the years, particularly in difficult times and so on. And I've gone too far. I've forgotten that is the last one. So it is something so that's the other way I think that we can fight complacency. It's by hanging on to that fact that one day we will be in heaven and having that heavenly hope. I just want to finish by referring to a man called Basil Atkinson, and he was the librarian at Cambridge University for many years, which is actually it doesn't mean that he just used to stamp the books as they went out. It's actually a very senior position in Cambridge University, and he's a committed Christian, and he would actually go and he would preach. He would do open air preaching in the market square there quite regularly, which again is a very unusual thing for a senior member of the university to be doing. And he would often be heckled. And one day he was speaking, and he was talking about heaven at great length. And then somebody heckled and shouted, "How do you know what heaven's like?" And he said, "Because I live there." And I think that sort of sums it up really, that we sort of live one foot in heaven, and one day we will be in heaven. I think that's something that can really inspire us. Okay, I'm just going to close by just praying now, and I think afterwards there will be an opportunity if anyone wants to come forward for prayer for themselves. I'm sure there'll be an opportunity to do that, or if anyone wants to discuss any of the points that came up, I'll be happy to do that at the end as well. Okay, so let's just close with a prayer. Right. First of all, I just want to pray for people who, as we were referring to at the start, people who have maybe be suffering from domination or an excessive degree of control or excessive authority, unhealthy degree of control. Just pray for people who might find themselves in that situation. I pray that you just give them wisdom and guidance in dealing with it, that they might be able to get the help they need, that they would be able to say no to people where they're constantly having to say yes. And if it's the right thing, if they have to do what Jesus did and put a healthy distance between them and people, that they would have the courage to do that. I also want to pray for those of us who do find it difficult with friends and family, colleagues, people we know well, that we just find it difficult to be ourselves, particularly maybe a fear of speaking about our faith with people that know us well. Pray that you'd give us in that position just the courage and boldness, the freedom from fear to be honest about our faith and to be able to speak to people without feeling that we're going to lose something by doing that you give us the courage to do that. I pray for anyone suffering really from this familiarity that we've been talking about with the gospel and with the Christian life, and that's led to complacency. I pray that you'd help those of us in that position just to be able to maybe adopt a life of expectancy, expecting to just see God's power in our everyday lives. And finally, I pray for each one of us that you would help us to develop an understanding of that heavenly hope, just having that ultra big picture, that huge long-term plan, living with one foot in heaven, that we'd realize that whatever we're going through now is just temporary. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.